This is Join Us in France, episode 379. 379. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel to France. Today, I bring you a conversation with my friend Elise Riven of Toulouse Guided Walks about the wonderful Molière, my favorite playwright. I got to see a Molière play at the Comédie Française last week, and I am still so giddy about it. I really enjoyed the opera, I enjoyed the symphony, but I really loved the Comédie Française. It was my first time, but not my last. I'll try to go back every time I go to Paris. We got tickets for 30 euros, so it's not even that expensive, but you do have to book at least a month early. I'll be looking further ahead myself because it is booked up early. What was so special about it? Well, the Richelieu Theatre is beautiful, of course. It's on Place Colette, which everyone should walk to on their visit to Paris. There is lots to see in this area, and I'll probably write a VoiceMap tour on the Louvre and Palais Royal areas at some point because it's gorgeous and there's lots to say about it. But what makes the Comédie Française so special is that they attract amazing talent. I got to see Guillaume Gallienne and Julie Sicard in the main roles of Le Malade Imaginaire, and it just enthralled me the whole time. Everyone on stage was unbelievable. There was some singing in the play, and that choir was so good. These people are actors, singers, dancers, and they're all at the top of their game in every respect. I am such a big fan. Anyway, they're playing, and they were playing Molière, which they are doing a lot this year on account that it's the 400th anniversary of his birth, and I cannot recommend this more. I went to Shakespeare plays when I lived in the US, and I was rather befuddled, even though, my English is okay, right? And I know for a fact that even native English speakers do not get all of Shakespeare without some help. So don't be shy. If improving your French is a goal of yours, go see a play at La Comédie Française. You won't understand everything, but you'll have a good time anyway. And it doesn't get any more French than that. After the interview, I'll update you on the much improved travel situation with regards to COVID and French news, as well as my personal update. And I am grateful to have a lot of new patrons to thank this week. As far as itinerary reviews are concerned, I'm all booked up until April 19th currently. So if you'd like my help in crafting the best itinerary for you and your family, don't wait until the last minute. That's at joinusinfrance.com/boutique. But the big thing that I want to mention right away is that my Latin Quarter VoiceMap tour is live, and I'm really proud of the work I've done on it. I am sure you will enjoy it. You can buy it directly from the VoiceMap app, but podcast listeners get a substantial discount if they buy directly from me at joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And if you get it directly from me, I get to keep more of the money because Apple and Google don't take a big sales commission on every sale. So if you're planning on taking one or more of my tours, please get them directly from joinusinfrance.com/boutique, where you get a discount even if you just get one, and then the discount gets bigger if you get more of them. So it's good for everyone, right? You can follow Join Us in France on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, or Twitter, as well as YouTube. They haven't kicked me to the curb for no particular reason this week. Whew. And I'll also put my photos of the Comédie Française on the episode page, which you can find at joinusinfrance.com/379. Bonjour, Elise.
Bonjour, Annie.
We have a fun episode today about one of my favorite authors, Molière.
Yes, one of my favorite theater men, people, persons, because I love the theater.
Yes. So we're going to start with a little bit on the background of Molière, his upbringing, how he got so big. And, it doesn't get any bigger than that in French literature.
Exactly.
I mean, la langue de Molière is
French. And one of the reasons we are doing this is because they are celebrating the 400th anniversary of his baptism.
We assume that he was born very close to when he was baptized, but at the time there were no birth records. They only had baptismal records.
So Molière, and actually I did not know this because I've always associated Molière really with the south of France. Molière was born in Paris. He was a Parisian. He came from a basically fairly well-off middle-class family of tapestry merchants. And his uncle, one of his maternal uncles, was a composer who worked on song and poetry that was admitted to the court. So even though they were certainly not aristocrats or nobles or anything like that, they were, number one, well-to-do, and number two, they had a little bit of an entry to the world of the court and the kings.
Very nice.
And his original name, we should mention, of course, from the very beginning, was not Molière. Molière is his stage name. It's the name he took a little bit later on when he was actually already the head of a small troupe that was traveling around. But he was born Jean-Baptiste Poquelin.
What year?
In 1622.
Okay.
We assume in the very beginning of January of 1622. Yeah. And he was born in the first arrondissement of Paris. And you can actually go see a house where he lived for a certain amount of time. But what happened to this young man was that he was destined to study law. He was sent to school with the Jesuits. He actually was a moderately good student. Apparently didn't have a great passion for the studies, but he basically did what he was asked to do. And there was a basic assumption in that he would follow in his father's footsteps and take over the family business. Both of his parents were fairly well connected in terms of the upper merchant class of Paris. But at the age of 21, he decided and announced to his family that he did not want to follow in the footsteps of his father. And his mom, who obviously must have had a very, very tender relationship with him, because otherwise I don't think this could have happened, she allowed him to have his inheritance so that he could go off on his own and work in the theater.
Wow.
And the theater was something scandalous in the 1600s. If you were someone who was an actor or an actress, you were considered to be someone who was sinful.
Mm-hmm.
So
Loose, anyway.
it's hard for me to grasp, so I'm not sure. The idea was that there was a lot of music. Certainly at the court, there were lots of ballets and they put on plays and they put on comedies and things like that. But if you performed in the theater, you were considered to be a sinner. The theater was sinful. It was an old vestige of things from the early Catholic Church, that it was about secular life. You know, it wasn't about saints and things like that. So he was basically doing something that was out of the norm, really. And so he joined up. I don't know how. I wonder if anybody actually does know how. But he joined up with a group that was creating a theater company. And among them, there was a family, the Béjart family. If anybody has ever heard of Maurice Béjart, who was a very famous choreographer, it's actually a name that is very, very old. And it was two brothers and two sisters who were all actors and were famous already as a theater family.
Mm-hmm.
And he joined up with them, and his desire apparently was to play tragic heroes in tragedies. You know, I mean, this is interesting because it's really pretty contemporary with Shakespeare in England. It's just about the same time. I'd say it's about 10 or 20 years later than Shakespeare, but we're really talking about the same time period when theater is very, very popular with all classes of people. And what he wanted to do was be a great tragic actor. And so he joined up with this group, and they toured a lot around Paris and in Normandy, specifically around Rouen. where the Béjart family actually had connections to a theater. And I love this phrase I saw in one of the things I was looking at yesterday. They went back to Paris to what was considered to be a new theater that had machines. And as someone who has worked in the theater and studied theater, I love that. They describe it as machines, because what we're talking about is the trap in the floor that you can come in and out of, the machines that are the pulleys that pull the scenery up and down in the back. So it was considered to be the newest thing to have these machines in a theater. And they had one of the only 3 established theaters in Paris at the time. So by 1644, where he's 22, he's made a fairly good name for himself as an actor. And so far, he's been doing work with this theater group. And I don't know if he was getting itchy or whether he was hoping that there would be more to his life than that. But what happened was in 1644, the group left Paris. And they left Paris partly because they did what theater groups still do, which is they take the show on the road.
Right.
I mean, this is part of what they do, right? And partly because it was kind of stagnating in Paris. And I think they were looking for a little bit of new inspiration. Up until this time, if I understand correctly, and maybe you know more, they were doing plays that already existed. They weren't creating new plays. They were doing things that had already existed. But one of the things they were looking for, because this is what happened at the time, was they needed to find someone who would be their mécène, which means their
patron.
Patron, exactly, their patron. Somebody who would give them a space to perform, who would give them an annual salary so that they did not have to worry about whether they had enough people coming in to see the play each time they performed, and who would encourage them and give them the connections, because this had to be somebody who was rich and highly placed, so that their name would become more and more well-known. And so as it turns out, from 1646 till 1658, that's 12 years, they never went back to Paris. For 12 years, they went all over France. I looked at a map yesterday online. They performed a lot in the West, in Nantes and in eventually Bordeaux and places in the Charente. But mostly, they performed in the South. And they became associated with the South specifically because there were 2 dukes who took them under their wing. And first one, who happened to have been the Duc de Conti, who was... I'm probably going to get this wrong. It's really hard, I think he was one of the first cousins of the king. A duke is big, I mean, he's up there. But he had been a bad boy, and he had tried to overthrow the king, and so he had been pardoned. But he was told to get out of Paris. So he'd gone down to his chateau in the southwest, which was near Béziers. And having seen the troupe somewhere, he invited them to come to his chateau. And he liked them enough that he offered them a yearly stipend and a theater, and then told them that they were going to be his troupe. And so for a couple of years, they were under the sponsorship of the Duke of Conti, who, of course, was extremely well connected. And that was how they really became famous. And this is actually without even going back up to Paris, right? So the king had heard of them, who at first was Louis XIII, and then it became Louis XIV. The king's brother heard of them, and they would have probably stayed under the auspices of the Duke of Conti, except that after a few years, he got religion. This was a big problem because the works that they were performing were either these beautiful ballet comedies, which were fairly risque and, of course, filled with beautiful music and gorgeous costumes and dancing, or it was tragedies, or this is the period of time when Molière starts testing out the idea of farce.
Mm-hmm.
And the farce is basically very satirical plays making fun of various different prototypes of people in society.
Right.
And all of a sudden one day, basically, the Duke of Conti kind of went, I don't think I can do this anymore. I am so sorry. And so they decided maybe it was time to go back to Paris. which made perfect sense because by this time they had been told by the Duke d'Orléans, who was the king's brother, that he was interested in having them come before the court. And so they were invited to perform in front of the court. And it was the very first time that they performed for Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, this was in 1658, Louis XIV invited them to come to Versailles. And one of the first things they did was they put on a tragedy by Corneille.
Yeah.
And according to some of the information I have read and a program I saw recently about it, Louis XIV liked to be entertained. And he had heard that this group was wonderful because they danced and they sang and the women were beautiful and they were wonderful and very entertaining. And he expected something like that. And instead he got a tragedy and apparently was about to get up and leave when Molière, who saw what was happening because he was the head actor after all, he literally stopped the performance in the middle and went backstage with his troupe and said, okay, we have to do something else because, of course, if you were not under the patronage of the king, you were going to lose patronage everywhere else. And what I understand is that he decided, since he had been greatly influenced by Comédie dell'arte from Italy, was the idea of the farce with a silly costume and exaggerated movements and exaggerated phrasing and everything else. He came back out on the stage and he performed for the king himself, and the king was delighted. And it was from this point on till the end of his life that he was under the king's patronage. This is Louis XIV. There were times when he actually was with the king in Versailles. There were times when he was in his theater in Paris. But one of the things that's really strange is that besides the theater and besides doing more and more of these satires, he had the role that was inherited from his family of being one of the king's valets. And so for over 12 years, actually until his death, one period of the year, apparently it was a trimester, which I think is what we would consider to be a quarter, I guess is like 3 months out of the year, he had to be at Versailles, and the king's valet is the person who stands there behind, the curtains were closed around the bed for the king, but of course there were about 50 people who were standing there waiting for the king to wake up. I mean, this is what the court was like in Versailles. And so every single morning for 3 months out of the year, he had to be there when the king woke up. And what did he do when the king woke up? I haven't got a clue. Maybe he handed him his underwear. I have no idea.
We don't know.
We don't really know. But it's an official title, the king's valet. And he stuck to it and apparently was very, very good at it. And in fact, had a very close relationship, even though he was not a nobleman, with the king Louis XIV, who outlived him by quite a lot, actually. So Molière, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, at some point in his going around France in these 12 years of traveling around and performing, he took the name Molière. Nobody knows exactly why, really. I was reading that there are lots of different suppositions about why. It doesn't have any meaning specifically.
No.
It was a stage name. However he came to use it, nobody really knows. But then it really officially became his name. So from then on, he was simply known as Molière. And once he was back in Paris, he had so much money from the sponsorship of Louis XIV that he was able to have his own theater. And of course, the theater that he had, it was rebuilt at some point. This is now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the 1660s. It became the theater that is now the Comédie Française. It is right next to the Palais Royal. It was a small theater. It was torn down and rebuilt, and it was the theater that Molière and his troupe used for the rest of his years until he died in 1673.
Right, and it's on Place Colette today.
And it's, of course, right next to the big park that's part of the Palais Royal. And one of these days, I'm going to go see a play at the Comédie Française, even if Molière is no longer there.
Me too. That would be lovely.
I would love to.
Yeah.
It's one of my dreams.
Yeah.
And basically what happened with Molière was this, is that at some point in his career, he realized that he was much more talented at doing farce and satire than at doing drama and at tragedy. The critics, there were lots of them, said when they wrote about him and the troupe, they said he was wonderful when he was on stage doing a farce and imitating people, and he was awful as a tragic actor. So I guess he took the word of the people out there and he stopped trying to do tragedies. And from that point on, he did one major farce, one major piece that was a satire, biting satire. This is not, just nice stuff. This is not burlesque. This was really biting satire. They say that he was a great observer of humanity, and certainly he was privy to what was going on at the court, and that would probably give enough for anybody to talk about for the rest of their life, with the scandals and all of the other things involved. And he was somebody who was clearly very secular in his thinking, who had no particular propensity to want to either be a nobleman or to be religious, and who really saw the foibles of humans and their behavior. And so he wrote, and you're going to talk about this obviously in a minute, he produced one wonderful farce after the other. Altogether in his life, he's credited with 35 theater pieces, which were performed thousands of times by the time he actually died. And when he died, he died very young. He actually died at the age of 51. He was in the midst of performing his last piece, which was called The Imaginary Invalid. He was on stage when he was taken ill. Nobody really apparently knows what he died of, but it was only the fourth performance, and it was a huge success already. But they took him home, and he just got worse and worse. It seems that nobody really knows exactly what he died of, because there were rumors that he had already been sick, but apparently that was not true. He was probably feeling a little bit old because he had been performing for over 30 years as an actor, and traveling around is not the easiest thing to do. But he had more or less a stable family life. And so it was very strange that within 48 hours, he actually died. But one of the things I find absolutely astonishing, and it goes back to his idea of the observation of human nature and his biting satire, is that in spite of his fame and being wealthy, very wealthy by the time he died, he was not allowed to have a full religious burial because he was an actor, and actors and actresses and people who worked in the theater, unlike composers, this is very interesting, unlike composers, were considered to be people who were sinful. And unless on your deathbed you renounced your activity as an actor, you could not have the last rites. So what happened was he died, and his widow, who was much younger than she was 20 years younger than him, she appealed to Louis XIV and asked him if it was possible for him to have a Christian burial, because the Bishop of Paris had refused it, even though he was such an important person in culture. And Louis XIV said, yes, he can have a Christian burial, but without pomp and ceremony, with very few people around, and he cannot be given last sacraments. So when he died, he was wealthy, he was famous, he was considered to be a genius for his theater, and he was the person who put French theater on the map, because up until that point, it had been Italian theater and Italian music that had counted. And of course, he had collaboration with certain people like Lully. I know you're going to mention about what happened with Lully, the great composer who worked for Louis XIV. He is for France what Shakespeare is for English-speaking people. He is the great playwright. He is the person who created plays that are eternal.
Right. So it's very interesting to me that when I grew up with Molière, right? And in school, I learned about him.
I was going to ask you because I know which plays we have to read of Shakespeare in school. What plays do you know which plays you had to read?
So, Le Malade Imaginaire, L'Avare, et Dartuf
Okay.
were the three that I read in school and then read later on because they are so fun. And to me, I thought Shakespeare was going to be funny. Well, Shakespeare isn't funny. Even his comedies are not funny.
Oh, well, but they are. In English, they are. I mean, the different...
Well, I saw them in English.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But Shakespeare really specifically made 3 kinds of plays, which Molière didn't do. I mean, Shakespeare, he made a definition of what was tragedy and a definition of what was comedy. But comedy for Shakespeare was not like the comedy of Molière, which is based on Commedia dell'arte, which is more clownish and more, let's say, broad. It's the comedy of Shakespeare is much more connected to the idea that everything has a happy end. It's not so much. It's not gags.
Right.
Okay.
It is not.
No, it's not. It's a different definition of what comedy
right.
is.
Because
Okay.
I've seen Much Ado About Nothing, and I don't think I laughed once.
Yeah, but it has a happy end. That's why it's a comedy.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
They all live happily ever after.
I accept that. So anyway, Molière is very funny. He had some of the funniest lines, and it's actually pretty easy to get French kids to read Molière or to watch plays of Molière on TV. If you ever have a chance to see the performance with Louis de Funès in L'Avare, it is hilarious. Okay.
Does he use the real original language, or did he modernize it?
I don't remember. So maybe it was modernized, but it's not that different from today's French. Some words are different, but we can easily read Molière as a French speaker today. I don't think French has evolved as much as English has. I mean,
Okay.
Shakespeare takes quite a bit of work, even for native English speakers.
Correct.
I think Molière, it's not like that. I mean, so long as you're literate, but of course, I spent my childhood with my nose in books, so to me, it was like normal. I don't know. Anyway, his comedies are very funny. It brings out a lot of joy. But one thing that Molière did that I'm not sure if Shakespeare did that, is that he was a guy who put on performances. And Louis XIV loved a great performance. He loved to dance himself.
Mm-hmm.
He loved to be surrounded by actors and dancers and musicians. And so Molière put on fabulous plays, lavish plays with hundreds of performers, with lots and lots of things going on. And he was a showman, is what he was. He was, like you pointed out, he was an excellent actor, especially in comedies. And he mostly played the main role in all his comedies, and his wife very often played the lead female role. Unlike in England, women could be on the stage in France.
That's true.
And so his wife played a lot of the leading females. He put on fabulously funny shows. So much so that he did so much in his short life that there are people who wonder if he really wrote all these plays himself. There's no doubt that he, like the comedy and the way the plays work, was his doing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's entirely possible that he did not write every word and that somebody else, namely Corneille, probably wrote a bunch of his words. So Molière might have given him an outline of how he wanted the comedy to go, and Corneille went to task at writing the actual lines. This is not proven. This is entirely hypothetical, but I'm kind of convinced by that thought because he really was, if he did all the things that we say he did, he didn't sleep.
Well, he certainly, from what I gather, he certainly was a genius in a certain kind of way. I mean,
Yeah.
who knows? I mean, they say Mozart slept 4 hours a night too. I mean,
Who knows? Yeah.
it just briefly, because obviously the subject is Molière, but Shakespeare was not an actor. Shakespeare was a writer, and he produced the plays, but he did not act, and so there was not. It was very much more focused in terms of what he did.
Right. Yeah. Molière was, I mean, he was a showrunner. He hired the actors. He kept the books. He went around selling his services to everybody. I don't understand how it's possible for somebody to do so much. Anyway, a while back, I published a Patreon reward called L'Affaire Corneille-Molière. It goes into depth about whether or not
He
wrote himself every word that we credit him with. But it's neither here nor there, because either way, he was a genius.
He was a genius.
He was a genius. So, it's fantastic what he did. And, okay, I want to tell you one of the things that he was very good at, and of course he didn't do this by himself, is that he would put on plays with music. They were comedy ballets kind of thing. And he invented the style where there was a bunch of dancing. And so typically the actors had plenty of time to change costumes and whatever, because in between acts, the dancers would come on, and a lot of the music was by Lully, who was an Italian composer. And he was an extremely talented composer who wrote some beautiful pieces. I mean, there are some chaconnes by Lully that were used in the plays, and it was like a full body experience. You went to one of these performances to hear music, see ballet, hear beautiful words. I mean, it was an all-together kind of thing. And it was wildly popular, obviously, whenever it was performed in Paris or anywhere else. Now, Lully and Molière had a big falling out at the end of their lives. And at the end of his life, it was Charpentier.
If I understand correctly, though, some of the last satires did not have a lot of dance. They had music.
Right.
But they did not have dance because he really wanted to concentrate on the satirical aspect of it. And I think that the dancing diluted some of that. It was
right.
It's more of a kind of nice entertainment. And here at the end, the last few plays, he really was very acerbic about, wanting to really criticize things in society.
Right, right. And so it's Marc-Antoine Charpentier, who was also the composer in residence at the church in Le Marais. On
Saint-Paul.
Oui, Saint-Paul Saint-Louis.
Saint-Paul Saint-Louis.
He was the composer in residence at that church. Anyway, he wrote some very fun music as well for Le Malade Imaginaire, which was, and it's also funny that he died. I mean, he had this health problem on stage.
Yes.
While playing a man who pretends to be sick all the time.
Right.
And there he was, really sick himself. So it's like an irony.
It's interesting too. If you look through the names of the plays, there are 7 or 8, I think, that are famous in terms of their titles. But it is true that he wrote 3 plays that have to do with doctors. And one of the things I read was that he was particularly obsessed with the way medicine was dealt with. And I don't know whether it's because he had bad experiences. He considered that priests and doctors were hypocrites. Interestingly, because they're not quite the same thing,
But they were, because doctors back then didn't know.
They bled you.
Yeah, they knew nothing.
Right.
Medicine was not really a thing yet. So he was probably right.
It's also interesting to see, because I know I had read, but I don't think I've ever seen a performance of the School for Women, that a lot of people said that he had a very egalitarian attitude towards women, and that even in the troupe, the women were paid the same thing as the men, and he allowed the women to have a predominant role at certain moments in the theater company.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, because I would have loved to have met him.
Oh, me too. Absolutely.
He sounds like somebody that would have been really interesting to talk to, and sharp-witted, and probably a bit tormented at the same time. I mean, to to focus that much on issues in society, even though he didn't suffer at all because he did not come from a lower class background at all.
Right.
But it's very interesting that he was such an observer of human foibles, and
Right.
things like that.
So the one play I would like to talk about briefly is Dartuf, because it has become you can call someone a Tartuffe, right? Meaning a hypocrite.
A hypocrite. Yeah.
Now, the first version of this play was just a play in 3 acts, and it was called Dartuf ou l'hypocrite. And very quickly, it got censored and forbidden because, okay, the story goes like this. You have this man who is hyper-religious. He is not presented as a priest, but as a directeur de conscience. And it so happened that priests often had this role of conscientious director, as director of conscience.
Not sure what that is.
So a morality
Yes.
director.
Right.
But Molière never said he was a priest. He just said he was a directeur de conscience. And this man shows up in this household, and he has made a vow of poverty, obviously, because that's what one does, and a vow of chastity, and is very pious and wants everybody to know how much he prays every day. And of course, he is a total hypocrite, and he hits on the wife and steals the money and whatever. Okay. But he puts a great production of his piety. And so the first version of the play was a short play in 3 acts. It was shut down immediately.
And it was performed in front of Louis XIV.
It was. And he loved it. The king loved it. Everybody loved it. They thought it was funny as heck, and they loved it. Except the Bishop of Paris, who had been the king's preceptor as a child. So when they were both very much younger, he had been his confessor and whatever. And so he had the ear of the king, obviously. And he told the king, we have to put an end to this because this is not good for our image in the church. So stop it. And the king was like, okay, whatever. And they stopped it. They censored the play, as they did often back then. And Molière was very sad about this because he really thought this was a good play. And it is. And so he rewrote it as a play in 5 acts. He changed the name. He called it...
I thought he made it into The Impostor.
Right, The Impostor. But he even changed the name Dartuf. It's a different name. Panulf.
That's the name of the person.
So Dartuf becomes Panulf, and he's not a hypocrite anymore. He's an imposter. He is just as religious, but he is introduced to the family as a businessman, a bourgeois. And he's the bourgeois who's going to help him make even more money. So this guy appeals to their desire for money and for wealth and is an embezzler. He steals the inheritance, okay? So he is an imposter after the money, but he's still overtly religious, okay? And that play is performed once and shut down again and that one was in 5 acts. So Molière is like, how do I do this? And he rewrote the play. He called the name went back to Tartuffe. Right. L'imposteur. So the one we read today is the imposter, not the hypocrite. Okay. But he shortened it a bit. He changed the name back to Tartuffe. And it so happens that the Pope wrote an edict. I don't know the details, but the next day that this edict came out, it was some kind of liberalization of kind of the church demands on, because up until then they had been saying anybody who performs this is a sinner and is going to be excommunicated.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were like, if you perform this or read this, you could be excommunicated. And this was a huge deal. The Pope liberalized all these rules. The next day, they started performing Tartuffe again, and they performed it, I think, 75 times that year. It was a huge success. Everybody came to see it. And the reason why this play is so important is because Again, French people have this reputation as being anti-religious. But what really Molière is against is the people who wear their religion on their sleeve and use that to embezzle or to take advantage of people around them. And so anybody who is overtly religious in French society is suspect. Whether they are Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, anything. To us, overtly religious people is like, yeah, what are you hiding?
It's interesting that this was 120 years before the revolution. I mean, this is the century before the revolution. But I think it was also the fact that there was so much censorship on the part of the church.
Oh, yeah.
That there was one of the reasons Voltaire was so revolted against the church a little bit later on. Is it wasn't, as you say, it wasn't just that people could be practicing a religion, but that they controlled too much of people's lives. And I think it's interesting, too, that Louis XIV, who was actually relatively religious personally, he was fine with all of this kind of farce and satire. It didn't bother him that much.
Well, because it was a way to let off some steam, in his opinion. He had an iron fist over the country, really. But if people could let off some steam, have fun, make light of these Dartufs who make our life difficult sometimes. But he was such a caricature. Dartuf was such a caricature of what really happened in everyday life that to the king, it didn't seem like dangerous. It seemed like, let off some steam. It's fun.
Right. I think it's the idea of pretentiousness, of self-importance and pretentiousness that he wanted to break the abscess, basically, of this. And there must have been quite a bit of it. In the upper class circles. There must have been quite a bit of it, people who considered themselves to be so important. And of course, the clergy had a huge role in society in general.
Right.
So
it's really interesting that in Dartuf, so in the last version, the one that we read today, he only comes onto the scene. Dartuf only comes into the scene in the third scene. So the play has been going on for 10, 12 minutes already. And he comes in and there's this young lady who's, for the time, scantily clad, I guess you would say. She's showing off a little bit too much. And one of the first things he says is, "Cachez ce sein que je ne saurais voir." Hide that breast that I shouldn't be seeing. And, it's not his problem that he's a horny idiot. It's her that has a problem. She's showing off, right? She shouldn't be showing off. Hide this thing. And again, in today's society in France, women are like, hey, I can go to the beach bare-breasted because I want to. And that is a fundamental demand of French women. And it comes from Molière, really. I mean, this is where it started. And that's why French people are kind of shocked by the whole Muslim head covering, even though back then French women put on a scarf when they went to church.
Yes.
I think, and still in very religious churches,
they do.
They still
wear
do.
A hat.
It's a scarf usually for women. So, it's this delicate dance that we do with religion in France. And it's perfect in Molière. And of course, L'Avare is absolutely wonderful. If you can only read one Molière play, L'Avare would be great.
Which translates as The Miser.
The Miser, yeah.
The
It's
Miser.
a great play. All of his plays are funny. And now, I haven't seen them in English, obviously, but I'm assuming that the translations are good. Like, there's got to be some good ones.
I've seen The Miser, and I can't remember if I saw Tartuffe in French or in English, but I know I have seen The Miser in English, and it translates quite well.
Yeah.
Of course, you don't get the music of the words,
right?
That is one of the problems. Again, as a comparison, I have seen several Shakespeare plays translated into French, and since I know every play by Shakespeare, just about, I can watch them. But I have to admit that it's strange for me to hear it in French. So I don't know about Molière in English, except that it's so much more present in terms of the idea of hypocrisy and blowhards, and people like that people get the idea.
Oh, yeah. Before going to a Molière play, you don't have to have it explained to you.
Right.
The way Shakespeare, you kind of have to have it explained to you. Because you're like, what was that? Yeah. No, Molière, no. You don't have to get anything explained. You'll get it. It's, it's funny. It's entertaining.
The language is also very wonderful. And it is interesting to me. I don't know how many, because I know that some of the earliest things were written in poetry. And then, of course, the last plays were written in prose. Mm-hmm. But it's a very beautiful language that he uses. It's very, very interesting. It's also interesting to know that his idea of theater and acting was what we could say very modern, because even at the time he said and he wrote that he did not want to have, somebody standing there and sort of just stiffly exclaiming things, but he wanted the acting to be much more natural and to people to move around in a much more natural way on the stage. So I would say personally, I think that he's one of the fathers of modern theater. He really is.
Probably, yeah.
Because his concept of what goes on the stage, he didn't he didn't want people just to be sort of these stiff cartoon things just standing there and exclaiming verse, which is something that you can still find in certain kinds of theater. But the interaction is very natural. The movement is back and forth is very natural, and it is very much, I think, farce is something everyone understands.
Yeah. Yeah, and if it makes you laugh, that's it. Game, they won.
Right.
The playwright won, because it's hard to make people laugh, especially intellectuals who enjoy a certain level of, beautiful language and, these are not scatological plays. These are, kind of highbrow plays, really, but they make you laugh. And so it's a high art, I think, to make people laugh on such serious subjects and with such beautiful language.
Yep.
Because none of it is vulgar or debasing. So I'm going to try and find some performances of Molière plays. I'll try to find one in French and one in English. It'd be good to have one that's like with subtitles. That'd be ideal, right? If I can find
Now,
it.
I know that they've done some filming of the theater pieces. Maybe one of those would have some translations attached to it.
Well, and the movies.
Have they done many movies?
Oh, yeah. L'Avare with Louis de Funès. It was performed as a movie. It was made as a movie of a play. And it is hilarious. But I don't know if it's available anymore because that movie is probably 50 years old. It's very old, but it's very funny.
I wonder about the others. I don't know if any of the others have been turned into a movie.
I'll try to find them. If I find them, I'll put them on the episode page. And, have fun. Just
here's a short list of the ones that, for me, are the ones that I think of as being the most famous ones.
Yeah.
The Imaginary Invalid, Dartuf or The Imposter, The School for Women. They actually did 2 or 3 about women, with women in the title. And
yeah, that's called L'École des Femmes.
L'École des Femmes in French, right? The Misanthrope, which is, of course, the Misanthrope. I love the Misanthrope.
Yeah,
I think it's
forgot
wonderful.
about it, yeah.
That's one I have seen. I love the Avare, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme.
Yes.
And Les Fourberies de Scapin.
Oh, yes.
And I tried looking up the word. It's very, very difficult to explain fourberie.
Une fourberie. Être fourbe is someone who lies, but in a very sophisticated way. Donc, une fourberie is someone who deceives you, but you go along for a long time before you realize that it's a deceit. That's une fourberie.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So here we are. Cynicism, hypocrisy, lying, all of the faults of human behavior.
Yes, and Molière, bless his heart, was born 400 years ago, and we still enjoy him greatly in France. And if you're lucky enough to speak French, enjoy it in French, because it's perfecto. Merci, Elise.
Thank you, Annie.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you have done it for a long time. You are amazing. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Catherine Roeder, Sandy and Eric Oxon, Connie Watkins, Nina Little, Manuela Richardson, Brooke Clark Carter, Peggy Lane, Cassie Aw Yang, Susan McDowell, Michelle, Jean Powanda, the Anonymous Man of Mystery, Liz and Elaine M. Baudouin. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. And my thanks also to Deborah Gudger for sending in a one-time donation by using the green button on any page on joinusinfrance.com that says tip your guide. She bought all my VoiceMap tours from the website. Thank you very much. And immediately also made a donation, which is very sweet. I guess she thought that I'm selling those tours too cheap, which, yeah, probably. But thank you very much. Another way to support this podcast is to hire me to be your itinerary consultant. Here's how it works. You purchase the service on joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Then you tell me what you have in mind. I go to work. I write up what I think is best for you. Then we talk about it on the phone. You ask all your questions. And then I send you an amended itinerary that really matches what you want. It saves you a lot of time. It ensures that you get feedback from a local. I am all booked up, like I said earlier, until April 19th. So if you would like the service, book it several months ahead of your trip, or I might have to turn you down. I'm turning down quite a few people, as a matter of fact. Now, on top of having released a new VoiceMap tour of the Latin Quarter, I also updated my Île de la Cité tour. And if you've bought it in the past, whether from me or from the app, you can get the new version of the tour. So to do that, open the VoiceMap app and log in if it doesn't recognize you automatically. At the bottom, tap on Account. Then choose the tour that you want to update and swipe left. That will delete the tour. You need to delete it first, okay? We can't get the new one if you haven't deleted the old one. So once you've deleted it, go to the Purchased tab below your name and tap Download. You have to confirm the download before it starts. You're absolutely entitled to do this. It's free. It doesn't cost you a penny more. And like Patricia has told me several times, I'm one of the few tour authors that actually updates the tours because she is a fan of audio tours and she's tried several and she's told me that some of those tours are really, really out of date. I make a point to update mine when it's important to do so. And these are also tours that you can listen to from home. You can do a virtual tour where you just listen to me talk about Paris and you can see the dot moving automatically. And of course, you're not there to see what I'm talking about. But it's a fun way to discover the app anyway, and you can listen to it as much as you want to. Big changes on the COVID front in France, starting last Monday, so that was February 28th, 2022. Masks are no longer mandatory in places where the vaccine pass applies. So that's museums, movie theaters, and restaurants. But masks remain mandatory in transport, such as planes, trains, taxis, buses, etc. And they are also mandatory at medical facilities and nursing homes. This will change again on March 14 coming up, when the vaccine pass will not be mandatory anymore unless you're going to a nursing home or a medical facility. I've been asked if that means that airlines that will fly you to France will stop asking for vaccine status after March 24th. And the answer is, I'm not sure. And it really doesn't matter what I say anyway, because if the gate agent says you're not coming on this flight, then you're not coming on this flight. So airlines all email their customers. They email you your check-in documents. Do not ignore that email. Read it carefully. It tells you everything you need to know And yes, do what your airline says, okay? It is going to be really, really nice that people landing in France won't need to get a vaccine pass right away. I would still bring proof of vaccination just in case, but no more vaccine pass after March 14th. French people who go consult a surgeon or a specialist at a hospital will need to show their vaccine pass, and also to go to nursing homes to, visit family members or whatever. And that will probably last for a little bit longer. But that doesn't affect visitors, because should you need emergency care, of course, you would get it, whether you are vaccinated or not. So for the last 2 weeks, I think maybe 3, when flying to France, you haven't needed a recent negative test. You'll still need it to go home for now, but to fly into France, you don't need it. But if your airline requires a test, then you're going to need to get one. So do pay close attention to what the check-in documents that the airline sends you say. And if they haven't sent you your check-in documents yet, no panic. They will send it to you, and then there'll be time to do what you need. Personally, I will continue to wear a mask inside of stores because the thought of going into a store without a mask creeps me out. I'm sure I'll take it off eventually, but I'm not ready just yet. That's going to be the question now. Are you ready to live like it's 2018 again? That's for you to decide. I'm getting there. I'm getting there soon. In France, COVID numbers are falling rapidly, both in terms of new cases, new hospitalizations, and deaths. People over 50 who are not vaccinated are still sitting ducks for this virus, even if they don't believe it. It doesn't matter what they believe. They're sitting ducks. The numbers show it. So if you haven't been vaccinated, do it, okay? About the Ukraine. Oh, such a terrible situation. People in France, like everywhere, are worried about the humanitarian crisis created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're not nervous about war reaching France at this time, but we're horrified at what's going on over there. It's a fact that this war at the door of Europe is changing minds in France and Germany and in most European countries. Number one, we need to push the accelerator on getting away from our dependence on oil and gas, especially when it comes to oil and gas from Russia. Wind, solar, hydrogen, nuclear all need to be on the fast track. Sure, nuclear is not ideal, and some people don't like windmills, but we cannot stop using oil and gas without those solutions. We have to be pragmatic about it. So, yeah. Number two, and I'm at fault for this, I've always recoiled at big military budgets. And I know that Germans are even more hesitant than French people about military spending. But, when you have a madman at your doorstep with the second largest army in the world, it's easy to see that it's vital to develop a European military force. It is worth hiring and training brilliant people to develop the capabilities and keep the soldiers trained and ready, even if we never need them. I'd rather we never need them, but this is like car insurance. You buy it, you hope you never need it. But if you don't have it, you're in a world of hurt. So it's changing minds in France quite rapidly. This is something Emmanuel Macron has said, is this is a new phase in European history. And I think, as I can see right now, it's bringing more people looking towards a European solution to this problem than a few years ago. When Brexit happened, there was a ton of talk of all these countries leaving the EU, and now it's the opposite. All of these countries want to join the EU and NATO as well. Emmanuel Macron waited until the last day possible to announce that he's running for a second term. The first round of election will take place on April 10th and the second round on April 24th. He made his announcement through a letter that every regional newspaper published. The letter has also been shared widely on social media. It's been all over the news. He's just going to do a couple of rallies, I think. He's not going to be campaigning a lot. There's going to be one official campaign video each week, and that's it, pretty much. He hasn't said if he's going to do TV debates yet. But despite all of this reluctance to spend time on campaigning, there is little doubt that he will get re-elected. He was elected with 55% of the vote on the second round 5 years ago, and I think he'll do even better this time. For my personal update this week, well, it's good to be home. I've been home for almost a week. It's been a busy week because I had a lot of itinerary reviews piling up, but I got through it and it was good to talk to several of you last week. I also put the final touches on my Latin Quarter VoiceMap tour and it is now live and that is good. And I encourage you to check it out on joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/379. And next week on the podcast, it's going to be a very interesting episode about getting a long-term visa for France with Sarala Terpstra. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Which I recorded a while back. And it seems like things have changed a lot when it comes to getting a visa to come to France. And speaking of that, I also got to have a lovely dinner with Alison Lunis, who is the producer of a podcast called Transformation. And I was on her podcast a while back, and I'm going to invite her on Join Us in France because she has a business that helps people move to France and offers lots of services for those people. She's written a couple of books. She was very kind and gave me a free copy. So it's a big book. I have a lot of reading to do. But anyway, thank you, Alison, and I'll have her on the podcast soon. But regardless of the wonderful services that Alison provides, it's good to hear from regular people who have moved to France and how they pulled it off, because a lot of the time you have to understand the mindset first. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2022 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.